Our guest today is someone whose research made my jaw drop in the best way. She is a pregnancy physiologist, best known for her research on creatine's effects during the pregnancy and postpartum phases of life on both mama and baby. She is the research group head for the Bioenergetics and Reproduction Lab at the Hudson Institute of Medical Research in Melbourne, Australia, with a PhD in obstetrics and gynecology and her bachelor's in biomedical science. Dr. Stacey Ellery, welcome to Wellness Fixes the Pod.
Oh, hello, Kelsey. How are you? It's so lovely to be with you.
I want to throw it back to the episode where I first found out about your research with Dr. Katie Hirsch, and we talked about creatine and its effects on a woman's body, and she casually mentioned that there was this researcher out of Australia who was researching creatine's effects during the perinatal phase of life, and I audibly gasped. I just couldn't believe that there was someone out there researching on this super important phase in a woman's life and how something like creatine can help. So I'm just so grateful for the research you're doing, and I'm so grateful you agreed to come on because I was so excited for this interview and to learn from you and just have everyone else get to learn from you as well. So thank you so much.
Oh no, it's my absolute pleasure. I absolutely appreciate the opportunity to come and discuss our research. In some ways, it's still in its infancy when it comes to looking at the benefits of creatine for women's health, but there are so many little Easter eggs out there which are pointing us towards really interrogating this because it could really be super important for women across the reproductive cycle. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here to discuss what we do know, what we don't know, and what directions we're taking to fill those knowledge gaps.
Let's start high level. We've covered creatine before on this podcast, but I don't think we've even covered it from just a very basic grade level perspective. So what even is creatine and what role does it play within our bodies, especially as women?
Creatine, the take-home message is that it's involved in energy production within our cells. So it's an amino acid derivative. We find it in meat-based animal products, but our body also synthesizes it. And it's kind of like a little magnet for something called phosphates. So phosphates are the energy currency within our cells. Everyone may have heard of adenosine triphosphate or ATP. That's the go-to energy molecule for all of our cells. We need ATP to keep cells functioning. And creatine plays a critical role in storing the phosphates in our cells that are needed to make that ATP. And so when creatine enters into our cells, either being transported in from our blood system or some cells make it, it holds onto a little phosphate and it just holds it tight and lets the cell continue to make energy through its immediate pathway, which is that oxygen and glucose metabolizing oxidative pathway that we all know about. But then when there are shifts in energy demand, that creatine can release that phosphate and it can be used to make ATP really quickly. And that's its important role within the cell. And that's why we start to hear some really, maybe even conflicting information about creatine. We know it's important for skeletal muscle and exercise performance. And now there's a lot of chatter about the brain. And then I'm going to sit here today and tell you that it's really important for the uterus and the ovary and the placenta and the baby. And the skeptics out there might be thinking hang on a second, this can't be some sort of wonder nutritional treatment that is going to tackle all of these things. And I appreciate that skepticism, but if we remember that it's about energy is critical across all of our cells. That is why creatine can potentially have a role and a benefit for multiple different tissues. It's all about quick energy turnover. And the other thing about creatine in the context of energy, which is really important to understand, is it's the only pathway that is easily manipulated. So if we have more creatine and we can get more creatine into the cell, we can store more of those phosphates, but we can't necessarily store more ATP or store more other energy molecules within the cell. So that's why it's really important too, because we can make it go up and make it go down through some pretty simple mechanisms.
That is wonderful. I love that explanation. I've never even thought about it as a magnet for those phosphates in order to help our bodies create that ATP too and have easier access to that, which, like you said, ATP affects all systems within our bodies and we need that energy for all systems in our bodies. So why, thinking backwards, why could creatine not also affect all of those systems within our body in such a positive way and not be this sort of, I don't want people to think about it as just this external thing we're adding to our bodies, because like you said, our bodies naturally produce it too. So it's not something that is just external. That's another supplement we have to add to our routine in order to maximize our health and wellness. This is something that is in our body naturally and helps multiple systems within our body. So thinking about creatine like that magnet and how it, from an overarching perspective, helps our energy levels and produce energy within our bodies for all sorts of cells, I couldn't help but also think of, I guess, the old saying that creatine is muscle fuel. And like you said, we think about it with skeletal muscle, like our typically exercised muscles being, oh, this is what creatine is good for. But now, like you said, we know it's good for some of the neurological systems within our body, reaction time, power. But as I was prepping for this episode, I was also trying to shift my perspective towards your research and your expertise within the female reproductive system, and knowing that that is probably more of a smooth muscle system. And how does creatine actually affect our not only skeletal muscle system, but also that female health and our female reproductive system, like in your research?
Yeah, so it all comes down to cells needing enough energy to conduct their processes. And so for skeletal muscle, obviously the processes that are really important are those contractile functions. And there's a lot of creatine in skeletal muscle cell because they have that high energy capacity and the need to do that. For our reproductive tissues, the easier way to think about it is the regeneration. So if we think about the female reproductive cycle, we have follicles developing every month and eventually releasing a mature oocyte. We have our functional layer of the uterus growing and then shedding away with the menstrual cycle. And all of those processes are super high energy demanding. And so that is where creatine comes into it. So we've been able to show, and others have shown, that cells that just have a high energy capacity because they're constantly turning over do actually use creatine to help balance that energy requirement. So it's a little bit of a shift in the thinking from what we traditionally consider the role of creatine, where energy burst and contractile function. It's more about tissue regeneration and building and the energy required to conduct those processes.
I hadn't even thought about the need for regeneration every month. Like that's, and the menstrual cycle is a primary example. And I know we'll get into the pregnancy, postpartum, because I know that's probably even more related to some of that regeneration and that turnover a little bit too. But I had never even thought about it in that regard. So that's awesome.
I mean, when you think about it, in a pregnancy, you're growing a whole new little human being. You're growing a whole new incredible organ simultaneously, which is supporting the development of that new little person and conducting all of the major organ systems, that being the placenta. And so the sheer amount of tissue development and generation that's occurring through that process in what is relatively a short period of time, in that 40 weeks, high energy demands, and cells really require to tap into all of their energy producing systems, including creatine metabolism.
So when we're talking about creatine, and we'll talk about it through, let's say, the female reproductive system as our lens, but is there an increased benefit for utilizing creatine during, let's say, different phases of our menstrual cycle, or different trimesters in pregnancy, or even when you're trying to conceive or in that postpartum phase? Are there increased benefits of creatine utilization throughout all of those phases?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. And the answer is we're at different stages of our understanding for those different elements. And so we have a relatively good understanding now that, as I say, creatine is being used by different cells within the body throughout that process. So we know creatine is used for the oocyte during that maturation phase. We know that there's creatine in the uterine fluids around the time of ovulation. Sperm love creatine. They have their very own little creatine transporter that's not found on any other cell in the body, with their motility and their function, with that key role of needing to get to the egg. We know that there's creatine in the uterus, the placenta, the developing fetus. What the research is still somewhat in its infancy is understanding exactly what role that creatine plays, whether if there's lower creatine than what we would anticipate seeing is tied to complications, whether that is with conceiving or the development of complications during the pregnancy or complications during labor. And then finally, because we can manipulate that creatine system quite simply using nutritional supplements, is there a benefit? And so in a nutshell, at the front, so in that reproductive conception phase, we don't know much about the potential benefits of a creatine supplement at this point, other than there was one study looking in mice where they put creatine in the IVF medium and the little sperm did better. They swam better and there was a better rate of embryo production, but that's as far as we know in that space. In pregnancy, we've really been focusing on the benefits of a supplement for the baby if there is a complication due to oxygen deprivation, and we can touch on that in a lot more detail a little bit later on. Postpartum, we don't know very much at all at this stage, and it's all a little bit all over the shop, but we are working our way slowly through those different phases. And yeah, I'm happy to guide through what we do know and what we don't know for each of those different, very crucial time points in a woman's reproductive life.
Definitely. And I think viewing it from, like you said initially, that energy perspective, rather than, I was thinking about it from a, like you said, similar to skeletal muscle, like smooth muscle perspective. But if we think about it with the energy demands on our reproductive system during this phase in our life, it's so great, right? Like our bodies are going through so much. So I think that even that perspective shift helps you guys formulate questions too and hypotheses, but also helps me as someone who's learning about this for the first time to understand it in a little bit of a better way and how it could potentially be used for all of these different phases in such a positive way. So when we're talking about the creatine that's naturally occurring within our body, and especially in our female reproductive system and some of those organs where you find creatine, how much of supplementation can actually get to that area and affect that area positively? Or is there a maximum dose that might not reach there or might go somewhere else?
Yeah, similar to tissues that have been studied really intensively, so particularly skeletal muscle, it does appear as if reproductive tissues, there is a capacity limit to how much creatine that they will take up, and it really varies depending on the tissues. So in terms of the research for us, the most we know is around the uterine tissue during pregnancy. We know that we can increase uterine creatine content with a maternal supplementation by around 20%. In some ways, that's similar to skeletal muscle, but the caveat to that is that we don't know exactly how that creatine is being used, and then whether, if the tissue was stressed in a particular way, whether the tissue would do better with that extra creatine there. So it does have the capacity to do it. We just don't know yet what they're using that creatine for. So that is ongoing research for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about creatine's effects on fetal development, and especially during high-risk pregnancies or high-risk situations for the baby. What have you guys found that is a positive use of creatine for fetal development?
Yeah, absolutely. So our focus has really been looking at complications that arise during labor and delivery. It's a really devastating complication called birth asphyxia. Thankfully, it's not super common in countries like the US and Australia. In developing countries where they don't have the level of obstetric monitoring necessarily during pregnancy are still quite high. And basically, it's a complication that can arise which causes a significant drop in oxygen delivery to the fetus. So that might be a cord being compressed, the placenta coming away a little bit too early. Just a really long and strenuous labor can really start to challenge those energy reserves of the little fetus. And this oxygen deprivation, it can be particularly devastating for the fetal brain. We can get brain injury that can, lead to the infant not surviving, but also long-term neurological conditions such as cerebral palsy and other neurological disadvantages. And so we approached this as creatine being a way of increasing the energy whilst the oxygen levels were low. And the cool thing about creatine was that we could give mum a supplement, see if we could get that into the fetal brain, and just have it sit there in case a complication arises. Because this is the tricky thing about birth complications, especially. You know, you can have the most gloriously uncomplicated, boring pregnancy, and then in those final minutes have something really tragic happen. And so the creatine could sit there as an insurance policy, as a way that the fetus can continue to produce energy if there's a complication that arises where oxygen and nutrient delivery is shut off. And what we found through animal models particularly is that if we do increase the fetal creatine levels, particularly in the brain, but also in other organs, and then subject the fetus to oxygen deprivation at the time of birth, that the fetuses do much better. We have higher survival rates across our mouse, and we also use sheep quite often for pregnancy research. We've looked really intricately at metabolism of the brain. The brain is doing much better at maintaining those oxygen levels. And then we don't see some of the key complications associated with oxygen deprivation in the fetuses as well. So we see less seizures postnatally, we see better behavioral outcomes and better survival, as I said. So it's almost this idea of using creatine as an insurance policy for these complications that arrive. I guess not too dissimilar to how a lot of people use folate for the potential development of spina bifida. You know, there's not a huge number of babies that will have that complication, but we can use a safe and simple nutritional intervention to safeguard against it. And our approach to using creatine for the fetus has been similar.
That's funny that you mentioned folate, because one of the things I got out of one of my university courses was my professor, not her specialty at all, but she said everyone of childbearing age should be taking a supplement with folate in it because of this exact reason. And I'm not sure if she had a story with this or a reminder of this in some way, but it was something, I think it was a motor development course. And I was just like, okay, from now on, you know, it was funny. But
yeah, I mean, most of our cereals are now fortified with folate for this particular reason, so that women of reproductive age, we don't need to necessarily think about it too much in the lead up to the pregnancy because it's been taken care of for us. Yeah, we've been studying creatine in a similar mindset to the folate story.
And thinking about it as an insurance policy, because that's exactly how folate was presented to me, was like a just in case sort of thing, you know, like, oh, you guys are in college, you might not be trying to get pregnant at this time, but just in case, it can help the baby's brain development too. So thinking of creatine in that way. A few questions based on some of your research. Is there a timing component to this creatine for before labor and delivery? And then you are saying that typically the pregnancies leading up to labor and delivery are healthy, and then all of a sudden there might be something that happens in these animal studies that need the creatine that you guys have enhanced in or increase the capacity in their brains, that they've then had a more successful outcome after. Like it could be a completely normal pregnancy up until that point, and then they experience some sort of hypoxic event to cause some of this. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's the way we've been studying it. There are certain pregnancy complications which make the risk of those hypoxic events during labor higher, but they can occur through any pregnancy. And in terms of what we've actually been studying is we've just started with a healthy pregnancy and then a single acute hypoxic insult at delivery as our starting point. But we have done some really interesting work looking at particularly creatine in the placenta of common pregnancy complications. So your fetal growth restrictions, your preeclampsia. Across the board, we see in those sort of chronic environments of hypoxia and nutrient restriction that tissues seem to try and endogenously increase their creatine levels. So the placenta with FGR has higher creatine, the preeclamptic placenta has higher creatine. When we studied labor in women, so healthy labors, we see some interesting associations between the labor length and the sort of energy intensity of the labor and the amount of creatine being delivered to the fetus. We've got insights from some of our studies to suggest that the creatine might be more beneficial for some pregnancies over others. But by just studying healthy pregnancies and a direct insult, we can say, okay, it could be potentially useful for everybody. And if these other complications arise, we would just assume that they would also be beneficial. And we've got some evidence that, these tissues are turning to creatine for energy production during these complicated environments.
And it doesn't sound like it'll harm anything, even if, you might not have the situation that benefits from it as much as another situation. It's not like it has this harmful effect on the baby's development or the labor and delivery.
Yeah, I'm so pleased you brought that up, because that is something from the get-go that we have been so super conscious of, is that if we ever got to the point where we were going to be recommending creatine to everybody during pregnancy, that safety profile is absolutely critical, because we might be talking about a hypoxic insult occurring to one baby in every 1,000. So there's 99 babies there that have been exposed to creatine for no obvious reason. And in all of our experimental designs, we've always made sure that we have a group of animals or tissue explants that have been exposed to creatine at the same level, but just been allowed to successfully go through with their healthy pregnancy, and really done our best to interrogate what's happening. And we don't see any variations in the development of the fetus associated with that exposure to creatine. It's definitely something that we continue to be focused on. And as we move to human studies, it's definitely at the top of our priority list. But at this age, we don't see anything that concerns us. And I think it's an interesting point too, because even in the last 5 years, the number of women of reproductive age that are taking creatine has gone up substantially because of our increased understanding of the benefits, not just for exercise performance, but for mood and cognition, especially those that are sleep deprived. People might be shift workers. And so we have a lot of women coming to us saying they take creatine, they like creatine, but they're wanting to get pregnant. What do we know about the safety profile? For mine, even if our research, and hopefully it will, but if it doesn't get to the point where creatine is recommended as a safeguard in pregnancy or with a particular pregnancy benefit in mind, I think we're at a point in time where it's absolutely integral that we understand the safety of creatine supplementation during pregnancy for those women out there that are taking it for other reasons.
So are the current recommendations right now to not supplement with creatine during pregnancy and postpartum, or where is that line sort of drawn right now? And I'm sure it's different country to country.
Yeah, it's a little bit different country to country. The official recommendation is to not take it, but that's purely just a position based on the fact that there's not enough evidence to say either way. And everyone obviously errs on the side of caution. And then remembering that creatine, as you say, your body produces it, you consume it. If you're consuming animal products, particularly meat and fish, you're metabolizing creatine every day throughout your pregnancy. You're likely consuming it if you're on an omnivorous diet. There really is no toxicity level associated with creatine. But having said that, you want to be conscious of these things. So at this point in time, it's really a personal decision and a conversation to have with your healthcare provider. And my stance is that there's no evidence to suggest that a creatine supplement taken in those dose ranges that are recommended for other conditions, so between 5 and 20 grams a day, is likely to cause any concerns during pregnancy. But we're still generating evidence behind that.
And based on what we know about the science behind creatine and how it works in our body, why couldn't we eventually get there one day to show it is super beneficial for women in all of these phases of our lives? Because even Dr. Katie's episode, she mentioned creatine loading in our luteal phase, pulling in that phosphate, pulling in that extra hydration into the muscles, because in our luteal phase, creatine loading can help with some of the recovery, power generation, all of that kind of stuff. So it's like, okay, wouldn't that be great to be able to apply that and have enough research, again, thanks to you guys, to say postpartum, when sleep deprivation and energy is just running a little bit lower, if we can have that recommendation and the research backing it up to say this is going to be so helpful for you too, as a woman postpartum or during any phase of pregnancy, labor and delivery, or postpartum experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the tide is definitely turning across all of those elements. I wouldn't say that it was, intentionally neglected, but I think people just didn't really think about the way in which our wonderful hormones, particularly estrogen, that is, so critical in that they need to fluctuate stages of the reproductive cycle to run all these components and ensure we have a healthy pregnancy. But they muck around with many different elements of the human body. So our brain, our capacity to exercise, all of those kinds of things. And so there really does need to be a focus on how we can understand those processes to start with, so that women don't feel like they're on their own and they're like, why am I so tired today? Or, oh, I'm postpartum, I feel like rubbish. Is it just because I'm there's something wrong with me? No, it's not. There's a lot going on inside your body and it's all interacting with each other. And so we need to understand those interactions. And if we can intervene in a safe and in an easy way, then we should do that. And we need to acknowledge that that research needs to be done and that women, deserve a little bit of help in those times that are tricky. They're really tricky.
And even trickier to study too and get approval for all of that, as I'm sure you're very familiar with too. I'm a physical therapist, and everything, you learn indications and contraindications and basically yellow flags. And pregnancy is always a contraindication or a yellow flag where it's like, we don't know if dry needling's because we don't want to test it and we don't want to find out. It's more of this cautionary approach where it's wonderful to have people like you who are willing to go through that effort to actually see where we can find benefit and help women out in all of these phases that are pretty demanding on our bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think historically people were trying to do the right thing. Like, oh, just let them focus on the pregnancy and let's not intervene. And gosh, it would be horrible if we did something and it adversely impacted on the pregnancy. But I think now if we sit back and reflect on the last few decades, at least of research, we can kind of say, oh, actually, that probably wasn't the best stance to take, because now pregnant women are isolated in many elements of medicine because we just don't have the right understanding of how different treatments or different approaches to management of diseases and things should be catered for in pregnant women, because we have chosen not to study in them. So I think the tide is turning a little bit, and through my experience of working with pregnant women is that they are just so generous with their time and resources, because there's this sense of we're all in this together. So I'm happy to help you out with your research if it's going to help somebody else in the future. So it's a beautiful community to work in. And it's fantastic that we are now slowly starting to get the opportunity to generate data in pregnant women and really find answers which are specific to their needs.
I always say I love being born in this time period because I really do feel like, exactly as you said, the tides are turning where women's health is becoming a more mainstream topic and a topic that a lot of people aren't shying away from. And I love being in it and a part of it and just learning about it. So I'm with you. I'm very grateful to be in this time and to see this shift happening, because I think it's just super, super cool. I mean, it was just probably not even 5-6 decades ago where strength training wasn't even recommended for women, where it was like, no, we don't want to stress your body. I know. So it's a fun time to be alive and be a woman at this time and learning about all of this and learning about our bodies in a deeper way. I want to refer back to some of your research on how and when to implement creatine during that labor and delivery process. Is it before? Is there a timing and a dosage component that you guys are finding in these animal studies?
Yeah, we do around a 2-week supplement prior to birth in our animal study. So the caveat to that being that, so for our mice, 2 weeks is half of their gestation. For the sheep, it's not a huge amount of their full gestation, and they're around 165 days. So we took a similar approach to the more traditional sports medicine exercise space where there needs to be a loading phase, and sort of we went with that kind of 2-week loading phase. We don't have a great understanding of whether we could lower that, and we're trying to have a think at the moment. Actually, I'm on the fence a tiny bit of, does it matter if it's safe and we can recommend it, say, from the second half of gestation, obviously accounting for the fact that we don't know when we're going to have our baby sometimes they decide to come a bit early. And so we could say, oh, 2 weeks out from term, start taking creatine, and then Bubs decides to come the next day. We've kind of taken the position of sort of focusing on the third trimester in terms of understanding what dose of creatine to take. And we're just doing pharmacokinetics studies in pregnant women at the moment. We've just finished recruiting and done all our measurements, sent the data away to our pharmacologists to do all of the different dosing. But at this stage, and it's not published data yet, but interestingly, we see that our pregnant women in the third trimester actually handle a dose of creatine in exactly the same way as non-pregnant women. So if they take 5 grams of creatine, we see a peak in plasma creatine around an hour and a half, 2 hours later, and then it slowly tapers away across the next 8 to 10 hours. So we actually thought that it would be quite different in pregnancy because, there's way more blood flowing around your body. You've got fetus taking up creatine, the placenta taking up creatine, changes in gut motility, changes in kidney excretion function. But no, so at the moment it actually looks like it's exactly the same. And we are heading down the path of validating that. But at this point, it looks like the recommendation of creatine doses in pregnancy will likely look similar to actually what people use currently for exercise performance or cognitive benefits. So somewhere between probably 5 and 15 grams a day in 5-gram doses.
And would you hypothesize that first trimester, second trimester would be the same? Or what do you guys think might be the case throughout pregnancy?
Yeah, we can only assume that if we don't see a difference between non-pregnant and pregnant women in the third trimester, we would unlikely see it in the first and second trimester, because that's where the largest amount of growth and obviously physiological changes in the pregnant person are occurring. It is interesting from our pregnancy studies, so where we've just looked at creatine levels, we actually see that creatine is really stable throughout pregnancy, but it actually, plasma levels in the mum sit around 30% lower than what we see in the non-pregnant population. So we started our measurements around 10 weeks. So somewhere between that conceiving and 10-week window, there seems to be this rebalancing of maternal plasma levels that we don't quite understand at this point in time. So that first window might actually be a real opportunity to try and increase creatine levels up again. But that's just some new exciting data that we're still trying to work out how to progress it forward. But yeah, at this stage, it's looking like standard supplementation, probably across the whole pregnancy, would be what we would be recommending.
And I'm sure you and your research group's minds go to the same thing about that 0 to 10 weeks if there really is that dip, like you said, correct? Or that's what y'all think?
It's just changing. And it's really stable, as I said. So we measured creatine levels in around 300 different women, large variation in terms of background, ethnicity. The hospital that I work within, we're a beautiful multicultural area. And yeah, it was a really consistent finding that there is this drop off. And so that's just the body not having the capacity to keep synthesis up and to keep absorption up when, there are other places for the creatine to go when you're pregnant. There's the placenta, the fetus, that kind of thing. Whether it's detrimental, whether it's just a natural thing that happens, we don't know, or whether if there's complications in that first 10 weeks, whether if you did have more creatine available, some of those complications might not occur, is a super interesting question that we'd like to get at too. Obviously, knowing the number of pregnancies that don't go past that first 10-week period.
That's immediately where my mind went, just knowing the rate of miscarriage within that first little bit of time. If we eventually apply that same insurance policy mindset to even having a healthy pregnancy and being able to conceive and have a pregnancy last longer than that 10 weeks, which I know is that sensitive area for a miscarriage, that would be super duper cool research to have and information to have. And I know that's exactly where you guys are at with your mindset too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have a little bit of evidence. I mean, a lot of miscarriages in that first 10 weeks, which is super common, like 1 in 4, which I always like to mention because I think a lot of women are still not super familiar with how common miscarriage is in that first, particularly 6 weeks, but 6 to 10 weeks. And it's important to know that if you're in that situation, you are certainly not alone. As I said, 1 in 4 pregnancies will end in that first period of time, primarily because there's something not quite right genetically with the developing baby. But we have seen some interesting initial observations of changes in the way in which the uterine lining potentially makes creatine between women who are fertile and women who are experiencing primary infertility. And that is that the women with primary infertility actually look like they have a higher capacity to take up creatine in that luteal phase of the cycle. So after ovulation, when the uterine tissue is really growing up big and you've got the implanting of the embryo, and there's a lot of processes going on there which are energy demanding. There might be something happening with creatine metabolism there in women who are struggling to conceive, and that's definitely something that we're following up at the moment. And yeah, I'm really excited about seeing what we can do, because there is a percentage of pregnancies that are lost in that early period of time that we just don't know why. There's no clear understanding from a genetic perspective why that pregnancy wouldn't continue on. The women are healthy, the men are healthy. And so if there is potentially an energy issue that we could tackle with supplemental creatine, that would be amazing.
And you're saying in those with primary infertility, they can store it, but their utilization of it might not be as, I guess, up to 100% as someone who might not struggle with infertility in those early phases?
Yeah, so it looks like they're trying to store more. The tissues are increasing their expression of the creatine transporter to potentially get more in. And so we actually see that adaptation quite a lot. Again, harping back to those pregnancy complications, so a placenta that's not functioning really well, we see higher levels of creatine in those placentas. When the labor gets really energetically intensive and fatiguing, we see higher creatine going across to the fetus. In our initial studies of uterine slices, at least, we see that the transporter expression is much higher in women with that infertility. So the next step is actually to measure the creatine levels between the two populations. And I've got a study that's just about to get underway to do that. We got just a little hint from looking at some previously archived tissues that something might be happening there. And so now we're about to kick off a new avenue of research that hasn't been a focus for us, that early conception phase, and whether creatine could be a benefit there. So hopefully I'll have more data to share with you in that space in the coming years.
I love it, because I do think infertility is a very common topic right now. And like you said, it's becoming more and more talked about, and more women are understanding how many people go through it. But still, we're in this realm. And so I feel like some of the time I have this bias to think that everyone knows this, everyone understands this, when it's not the case at all, right? So I'm so glad you mentioned the 1 in 4 stat, and just helping other people understand that this is something that people are working on to help, because I know it's just the emotions that go into it and the physical challenges that go into it. It's a very, very tough process. So I'm very, very glad that you mentioned that too. I want to talk a little bit about how much you guys know about creatine in the fetus and in the baby. So we've been talking a lot about maternal, and we've talked about the brain development and the insurance policy with creatine for hypoxic environments for the fetus. But how are you guys measuring, or how are you understanding how much creatine is actually getting into the fetus and into the baby? And does that carry into possibly postpartum and breastfeeding and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that all of the key tissues in the fetus that uses creatine, and that our bodies are using creatine too, so skeletal muscle, the brain in particular, these reproductive tissues that I've mentioned, there is a slow accretion of creatine in those fetal tissues across that period of time. And the composition is really similar to what we see in adults. So the vast majority of creatine is being stored in the skeletal muscle. There's a relative chunk in the brain. In other tissues, there's some there, not as much as you see otherwise. And it kind of follows pattern of, is it a tissue that experiences quick fluctuations in energy, like skeletal muscle, which lean on creatine for energy production? Or is it a tissue that really lacks nice, sustained energy and doesn't do well with fluctuations like the brain? That's where we're seeing the creatine levels. Interestingly, though, you bring up postpartum. So there's been a couple of really fascinating studies looking at creatine in the postpartum period, because anyone that's had a baby or knows anyone that has a baby how quickly those babies grow after they are born is like mind blowing. And again, leaning back on that energy for growth, energy for regeneration mindset. Obviously, there needs to be creatine to support those growing tissues, and even just for those tissues to have the creatine in them as they get bigger. So there's been a lot of research recently looking at creatine in breast milk, also looking at creatine in formula. And basically, we need to get our babies a nutritional source of creatine. Their bodies don't seem to have the capacity to synthesize enough to sustain that huge amount of growth. Breast milk definitely has creatine in it. Highest levels are in the immediate period postpartum, so in your colostrum and in those first couple of weeks. Then it fluctuates a little bit and starts to taper out. Formula, if it's cow's milk derived or animal derived, there's creatine in there. Soy-based formulas actually don't have any creatine in them at all, which is a little bit of a red flag for me personally, just knowing the need for creatine for growth and development. Perhaps if that's, the path you're taking, it would be worth having a conversation with your healthcare team about particular nutrients, creatine as one example that your baby might not be getting that they otherwise need. And yeah, there's still a lot to unpack in that space. But yeah, there's definitely a need for creatine to support that growth of the developing baby. And we know from babies that can't produce creatine in that early postnatal period. So there are some babies that have a genetic condition, which means that their bodies can't make it. So they're solely reliant on nutritional creatine. Those babies are usually super healthy and happy because they've had mum giving them an exogenous source of creatine for that whole period of time. If you take away that exogenous source and there's a sole reliance on the body making it, those babies start to get really sick and particularly show deficits in neurological capacity. So again, indirect measure, but clear evidence that creatine is important for our bubs in that early growth period postpartum.
So important. I'm amazed at all that is coming up and all that can come up in some of this research and all that you guys have researched. I'm just taking it all in too, because I think it's so cool. And you keep mentioning so many things where I'm like, oh my gosh, it'll be so cool once that research becomes available. And once we know more about that, and I know that's probably what excites you as well too.
Yeah, so definitely gets me up.
I know. And it's like you said, it's a fun group to work with and just be a part of, because it's been neglected for a little bit of time. And like you said, probably in a good way and in what they thought was a safe way and a helpful way. But now it's like, okay, we're biohacking the rest of our lives. How can we help pregnant women as well and babies in the postpartum phase as well too? So I know you are also recently postpartum. So if you don't mind sharing, how have you utilized creatine throughout your pregnancy postpartum phase, or what benefits did you see within your own body and possibly within your own baby with the use of creatine, if that was what you chose to supplement with during pregnancy?
Yeah, I have two little ones at home. I was definitely met with my research firsthand a couple of years ago of making that decision of what to do. We hadn't quite progressed some of our safety work as far as we have now when I was pregnant with my son, but I did decide to take creatine regularly. I wasn't really religious about it, I'd say. If I was having a smoothie or having a bowl of cereal, I'd just chuck a little bit of extra on. He popped out healthy and happy. I was very fortunate to have a super low risk pregnancy with him. And so I would probably fall into that 99% category of having the creatine and it being there, not showing any adverse outcomes, but also probably not needing to be leaned on from an energetic perspective. For my little girl, I actually didn't take creatine, partly because we were running our dosing study at the time and I really wanted to be a participant in the study. The stars actually didn't align for me to be able to do that for a few reasons. But yeah, I didn't actually take creatine with her, not because I had any concerns about it. It just, it was for other practical reasons. I have been taking creatine postpartum after my little girl, just because of the data that's come out recently, particularly around sleep deprivation, cognitive performance, mood, and even postpartum recovery. I say it out loud and I kind of shake my head at the fact that we haven't already been studying this for a long time, because it makes so much sense that there could be a potential benefit of creatine in the postpartum space. And I feel like postpartum is certainly that fourth trimester has been neglected in general up until recently. And yes, I have chosen to take it. I'm still pretty tired, but I feel okay. And yeah, you bring your personal life to your work. It's definitely given me the motivation to really start exploring that postpartum period, because in some ways it can be the most challenging after having a baby. And if we can implement some things, simple lifestyle interventions such as exercise or nutritional supplements in that space that isn't too onerous to add to the plate of postpartum women, but that could help, yeah, it would be fantastic to be able to do that.
Well, I have not been pregnant. I'm not postpartum, but if you ever need another study participant from Austin and from across the world, I'm like you, where if I can be that experiment for other people and for myself, because my body's my greatest experiment too. So if I can utilize certain things in certain time periods and understand it a little better, that would be amazing. It's just such a fun field to be a part of, because there is so much room for development and growth, and just like not even tangents, but like necessary tangents off of some of the current research that we already have. So
Yeah.
I'm super, super excited about it.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a great couple of, I'm going to say a couple of decades. I think that we'll see in the next 10 to 15 years, postpartum management change hugely, and for the benefit of mum and bubs, because yeah, they're just left to their own devices at the moment. And it's an incredibly, um, the physiological changes that are occurring in that postpartum period, particularly if you're breastfeeding, but also if you choose not to breastfeed, there's so much happening, so much repair, so much recovery, so much growth, so much hormone fluctuation going on, that we really need to understand that and to try and come up with some interventions to help women smoothly go through that transition phase.
Talk about something else that affects all systems of our body, not only our physical selves, but yeah, cognition, emotion, like fatigue, all of
Yeah.
those sorts of things
Yeah.
too. So I know we've talked a lot about a lot of different things today. We've covered so many topics, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel like you would like women to know about?
No, not particularly. I think we've covered everything, and I apologize if it's a bit of a whirlwind. I certainly can provide some easy to digest facts if that's helpful to share with your listeners. I guess it's just to point out that, especially in the creatine space, there's some really wonderful resources available which are research driven. So there's Creatine for Health, which is a wonderful resource. There's YouTube videos, links to podcasts, information that would just be helpful for women if they want to learn a little bit more about creatine. Again, just to try and get through the noise of the social media and the influencers and the people who have opinions but not necessarily opinions based in fact. I know that's really challenging to navigate sometimes. So just to point out to your listeners that particularly in the creatine space, there's a really wonderful collective of researchers from all around the globe that contribute to one platform, which is a go-to. Yeah, just to say that, I mean, throughout all of these experiences, be kind to yourself. Know that you're not necessarily in control of some of the changes that are happening with your body. Give yourself some grace, do what works for you. And yeah, we will continue to do our pregnancy and reproductive research with a focus on creatine to try and come up with ways to enhance and improve outcomes in that space.
I'm going to be so grateful for it. I'm already so grateful for it. So, Dr. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, for sharing your expertise, your passion for this field, for going through all of the hard work, both behind the scenes, I'm sure, in regards to funding and grants and all of the things that go into research, but then also in front of the scenes, actually performing the research and recruiting and just sharing your research and expertise and education with the world. I'm so, so grateful. I've been looking forward to this interview for, weeks and weeks, and ever since probably February when Dr. Katie mentioned it. And I'm so, so happy to have gotten to interview you finally today. So thank you so, so much.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. I just this tiny serendipitous moment when you contacted me back in February. My postdoctoral researcher, Dr. Nee Tran, who, if anyone wants to go and have a look at the science, you'll see her name pop up at the front of most of it, particularly the neuroscience. She's the go-getter there. She'd literally a couple of days earlier had a baby girl herself, and her name is Kelsey. So it was just this serendipitous moment of it all coming together. I was absolutely thrilled to be given the opportunity to chat with you.
That is funny. The name means brave.
Yeah.
So if she's a big name person, I love thinking about that for my own name. So that is super cool.
Yeah.
Well, you are welcome back anytime. I would love to have you on whenever new things are coming up and you guys find out new things, because I just feel like this is something that I am super interested in and will keep up with your research. I'll leave some of those links below and some of the researchers that people can look into if they're interested to learn even more.
Amazing. Knowledge is key. So happy to help out there.
Yes, I completely agree. And once you have it, it can't be taken away. So it's the more the better, right? It's
Absolutely.
insurance policy again. So, well, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you got a lot out of this episode and learned a lot. And I will see you guys again on the next episode of Wellness Big Sis the Pod.